Namaste. Welcome to another episode of the Immortal India podcast. This is me, Amish Tripathi. We are going to be discussing an extremely important subject today: how indexes are used to control those who are less powerful than the ones who design these indexes. And in conversation with me is someone who couldn't be better to discuss a subject such as this: Sanjeev Sanyal, a Renaissance man, Prime Minister's economic advisor, Chancellor of the Gokhale Institute, former chief strategist of Deutsche Bank, brilliant author, accomplished historian, shipbuilder as well. Is there anything you don't do, buddy? But jumping right into how these indexes work. These have been designed over the last few decades, normally driven from the West. Many of us have suspected that these indexes, these rankings of different countries across the world on human rights, on democracy, that these are used for an agenda. And you have studied this very deeply.
So, first of all, Amish, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. You're absolutely right. And let me say that it's not just indices and rankings. This is part of a wider system of control using information. So, let me put the wider context out, then you will understand why this is important, because the rankings and indices game is a subset of the wider problem. Basically, what happens here is that we human beings basically process data. We look for objective ways of trying to judge something. Okay, so what is being done is to first of all take control of information. In some cases, objective information. I'll talk about that later, particularly on medical data. But even on things that are subjective, human beings love rankings and indices and so on. And of course, it makes it very easy to then transfer that into real world things, like it could be in sovereign ratings, it could be in academia, it could be for investment and so on. So if there is something that is a properly legitimized, sanctified index of some sort, we will then use it to arrive at certain conclusions.
And for those who may not know, this has real world impact.
Absolutely.
So, sovereign rating, if India's sovereign rating is unfairly shown lower than another country, cost of money for us, foreign money, becomes more expensive.
Absolutely. So now let me come to the issue of rankings and indices. For this has been going on for quite some time, so it's not completely new. But you may have noticed that in recent years there's been this explosion of global rankings of various kinds. Happiness index, this index, that index. But there are certain rankings that have been going on for a while, like democracy index, media freedom index, and so on. Now, what basically is going on here is that a very small number of Western think tanks, and they're all in the North Atlantic, backed all in every single case almost by the same 5-6 sources of money. So there'll be USAID, Soros's Open Society, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and the European Union, and one or two others. But basically, this very small cabal then funds a somewhat bigger group of think tanks, and then these think tanks then create all these indices. And what they then do is they rank the world, countries or societies, on whatever they have decided is the best. So it could be a democracy index, it could be a freedom of media freedom index, it could be happiness index, it could be anything, any subjective thing on earth. Now, as I said, that this may initially seem like, okay, I mean, these are somebody's opinion. Why do we care about it? We care about it because these are things, as you just pointed out, that enter into real world outcomes. Sovereign ratings is one. But let's say, there is a large fund like JP Morgan or whatever. They actually use these indices in their investment decisions. Similarly, various kinds of risk analysis around the world uses these kinds of indices. It then feeds into academia. And so what happens, a certain kind of narrative gets set in the world about certain subject. Now a further thing is happening. You see, now this is getting fed into artificial intelligence as well. So now what happens when you have artificial intelligence, if you type in XYZ, are you a democracy? Say your kids or mine could Google, is India a democracy? Now, how does the artificial intelligence, whichever system it is, large language, whichever large language system it is, how do they decide that? They have been trained on certain kinds of data. So they are all basically the same ecosystem of information is then used to by them to come to certain conclusions, because eventually the algorithm doesn't know what is or it is not democracy. All that is happening is certain kinds of things have been told that these are legitimate sources of information, and then it does that. Now what will happen as a result is your kids will then grow up, because most kids are now not going to go into the depth of it. They'll just see certain is media free in India. This system will go in, search for a bunch of these legitimate, supposedly legitimate indices, rankings, etc., and come to certain conclusion, and it will tell you this. So this is how essentially narrative wars are fought. Now let me show you how this game is played. So basically, this small number of ideologically driven guys will fund this bunch of think tanks. Then they will create a bunch of indices. Now, people may think, these are famous institutions, varieties of democracy index in Stockholm, or Freedom House in Washington, whatever it is. And you'll think that, they must have done some great research, etc. The reality is that most of this is based on the opinions of a small group of people they have supposedly surveyed. They don't tell you who these people are. And very often they are just 5-6 people per country, perhaps. Just somebody, and maybe they're not even 5-6 countries. We don't even know because they don't tell you. Maybe they are 20, but it doesn't matter. I mean, would you even do a college election ranking or survey based on, doing some 20 people or something? But they are ranking the whole world based on these.
But VDEM, which makes this European organization, which makes this democracy index, and which doesn't think very highly of India, they claim that they do high maths and supercomputers.
Absolutely.
Why do you need high maths to survey 20 people?
Exactly my point.
Okay.
So what is going on here is that I began to write about their methodologies and begin questioning them about a few years ago. Now, initially, when I went into this, because this is not what I paid great attention to, I knew there was something fishy about it and I had written about it, but I didn't get into the core methodology. So I began to question their methodologies, and then I discovered all of this, that these are opinions of unknown people. They don't even tell you exactly how many people they are, who they are, and what opinion how did they arrive at these opinions. So I began to question them, and I wrote a bunch of working papers, newspaper articles, etc. So a level of sort of questioning happened. And notice that, if in a democracy index, we will call something like electoral autocracy, whatever that means. So they will use all these fancy terms to attach it to you to kind of show that there's something illegitimate about your democracy. I mean, in a list of 150 countries, we will barely make it in the 90th or in the 100 and something. So, we will be behind countries that have just have a coup, like South Korea.
South Korea was way ahead of us.
Yes, it was ranked, I think, in the 40s. Yeah. We were ranked in the 90s or 100s.
And they just had a coup. Military coup.
Yeah. So all kinds of these kinds of things happen. For example, Reporters Sans Frontier, they did a report in 2023 where they ranked media freedom in India below Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Below Afghanistan?
Yes. So, whatever on earth they come up with, and they don't feel any sense of needing to justify themselves. So, I began to question all of this. So, naturally, people began questioning. It's not just Indians, because, there were also people in other countries began questioning. So, somebody questioned the director of VDEM, Varieties of Democracy Institute in Stockholm. There is this chap in India who keeps questioning your methodologies and sees it's garbage. So listen to the answer. And by the way, all of you in the audience can look up this interview, because it's public and you can read up. So he basically says, we are like the physicists of the social science world, and all of this we are doing is based on high maths and supercomputers. You've got to be kidding me. I mean, opinions of 20 people, you can put it on an Excel sheet. Okay, and this is random nonsense. And so they somehow thought that Indians are going to be intimidated by computers and maths. I mean, this is like utter nonsense. But anyway,
No, if he's done social science in Europe, I think the last time he did physics was probably in the 8th standard or 9th standard or something.
so this is utter garbage. That's what I'm trying to tell you. That this is a classic example of talking down white speak basically. So anyway, point is, since then, a lot of what they were saying has been proved to be absurd. I mean, take America for example. I mean, in this presidential campaign, what was happening? An opposition leader had 2 assassination attempts against them. How on earth is that not to be counted seriously in their against their democracy? Or for that matter, if you look at the methodology, okay, you will find that the top countries in that are all kingdoms. So, for example, the top few countries are Kingdom of Sweden, Kingdom of Norway, the New Zealand, Commonwealth of New Zealand, United Kingdom. I mean, the main finding from all their indices is that a republic is bad for democracy.
You should have a monarchy.
I know. So obviously,
titular monarchy.
so it's utter nonsense. But you see, people have not called this out, and people did not. I think it happened by creeping expansion that these indices came to be. People accepted it and so on over time, till basically it reached a point where every think tank in the North Atlantic thought they'll come up with some index. Somebody will ask you whether you are happy, and happiness index. I mean, so some
One of the things I
nonsensical
noticed
things.
that in the happiness index, the countries at the top of the happiness index have the highest sale of antidepressants.
Absolutely. So
How
if
does
you
that add up?
well, if you have lots of antidepressants, you're happy.
Okay.
Clearly.
Okay. But these indices, how do they become credible? You said that there's a World Bank system or a UN
Yes.
system.
So the question
to,
is, how is it that these people get credibility? That is something also I discovered along the way. After all, you and I can also come up with an index. So why isn't it that this is ending up in the sovereign ratings or something else? So I discovered that there was a very well-oiled machine that gave certain groups of these indices legitimacy. And the center of this is the World Bank. So if you went to the World Bank's index, now they've begun to change it. So it is maybe now changing, but till November of 2024, if you went to their World Bank website, this is what you would find. You would have the World Bank's World Governance Indicators. Now, in there, they would list the indicators that they consider to be of high quality. Okay, so all these ones by VDEM, Reporters Sans Frontier, Freedom House, all these usual economist, intelligence unit, etc., they would list them down. And basically, they would have it on governance, social, various kinds of social and subjective topics. They would have a list of these. Now, those who are using it for academia or investment or any purpose or even training AI would then say that, look, this is World Bank, World Governance Indicators, therefore they must have done the research, they must be legitimate. So this is how they were given legitimacy. So when I began to hunt into this, I also wrote to World Bank, can you explain to me that you have got it in WGI? Can you explain to me how these methodologies make sense? So when I did that, they got back to me and said, please look at the disclaimer. So I scrolled down further. So the bottom of the page, there is a small disclaimer that used to be there, which basically says that the World Bank does not in any way take responsibility for either the methodology or the outcome of any of these things. And that if you have a problem, here is the names of 2 external researchers who are responsible for this. So some 2 random researchers who are not even in the World Bank were the guys running that racket on their website. So they're getting, the World Bank does not take responsibility, but happily gives them legitimacy. So I began to create a ruckus. So this was, I think, in 2022, I began to create a ruckus about it. Eventually, our representative in the World Bank also took it up with, raised it in various places, Mr. Param Iyer. And eventually, the others began to also say, we also have a problem. Thank God somebody raised it. So a small coalition of countries basically popped up, and they raised it in the board of World Bank. And so now, there has been a study in 2024, there was a study of the whole matter, In November, the World Bank issued a statement saying that from here on they would begin to look into the matter and see what their methodologies, etc. And some degree of vetting would happen in this. Now that hasn't yet happened, but I'm just pointing out to you that at least there's been some level of pushback. But it required essentially for us to go into their methodology, look into this, and essentially dig out the entire racket that is there. And as I told you before, all of these indices are all in the North Atlantic. There might be one or two from here and there, but basically there are dozens of them.
Former colonial powers, basically.
फॉर्मर कॉलोनियल पावर्स भी नहीं, मोस्टली यूके है और यूएस है और 2-3 यूरोपियन कंट्रीज के हैं. हाँ, फॉर्मर कॉलोनियल पावर्स यू कैन से. Basically, northwestern Europe. You won't even get other parts of Europe. So, very, very small number of countries have them, and even smaller number of funders. That's the point I'm making to you. These are basically the opinions of those 4-5 funding agencies. USAID was one of them. Soros is another one, and the others. So, basically, it's like money laundering. So, one group of funders have a certain opinion. They create some think tank where they create an impression that these are independent views. Then this is given to World Bank. World Bank gives it a stamp of approval, and then that goes into sovereign rating. So now what happens? Somebody is reading a sovereign rating. वो सोच रहा है कि ये तो opinion of S&P or Moody's or Fitch है. And in fact, in the case of India, on all objective criteria, we should be at least 2 notches up.
Correct.
Okay, but on some subjective criteria, we are held down to where our current sovereign rating is. So, nobody can tell that this is actually Soros's view, but it is hidden through this layered, legitimacy laundering process.
And you being a historian would know this obviously. During colonial rule, one of the techniques of the colonial rulers was to come up with a knowledge base or an information base to convince those being colonized that you are inferior and therefore you deserve to be ruled by us. They didn't just do it in India. They did it across the world, in Africa and
various racist theories, everywhere. Cultural theories, and so on.
And all theories to convince us that we deserve to be ruled by them. What's carrying on with these indices now is actually just that with new characteristics, essentially.
Absolutely, yes. And this is basically what, in fact, in those days, missionaries used to play this role of actually going in there and doing this. This is now being done by USAID and funded NGOs. Same logic. You go in there, collect information, twist the narrative. And you can do this in many ways. And let me give you another example, since this whole thing about USAID has just come up. Do you know that a large part of India's medical information was till very, very recently, till it was evicted a few years ago. Most of the medical information in this country was controlled by USAID.
You're kidding me?
Absolutely.
Within our country?
Within our country.
Not indices abroad?
Within our country. So, you may have heard of the NFHS, National Family Health Survey. It happens every 5-6 years.
It's a data that's used in many places.
Yes. All our health interventions are based on this. Okay.
No, many times social interventions as well.
Yeah, also social interventions. Yeah. Absolutely. So let me tell you a little bit about it. Did you realize that essentially till like 2022, so that's 3 years ago, the NHFS essentially was controlled and run by USAID. This was true from the beginning when in 1990 onward. So the last 3 decades, all the information collected in the country, analyzed, and then of course given out into the various kinds of interventions. And this, as you mentioned, not just medical but also social interventions, were based on data collected by this. So they gave it this name. You get this Sarkari sounding name, that the government of India. Sure, government of India was sort of involved. But it was basically that questionnaire was created by USAID, the analysis was done by USAID, and the recommendations was done by USAID or other NGOs affiliated by in that kind of ecosystem.
The government wasn't even involved in the recommendations?
No. So what happens is that you see the Ministry of Health is there. But the whole thing is, if I control all information about you, if I am the guy who controls your bank account information, your impression of how rich you are will be based on my opinion of what I show you, right?
And I'll do what you tell me to do.
Absolutely. So that is basically what was going on. So this is another case where I happened to dig into this. And I'll tell you the very interesting story how I got interested in this whole subject, because you have to remember that I am not a health economist. At least this other stuff is related to sovereign ratings, etc. I'm a financial markets economist, so I have some idea of those things. Health is not something I normally looked at. But what happened is that during COVID, as you may remember, I was part of the core team that guided the Indian economy through the COVID crisis. So at that time, I'm going back to the year 2020. At that time, I was also co-chair of one of the most important tracks of G20 called the Framework Working Group. Okay. Now, we are in end March, early April of 2020. Remember, we had gone into lockdown. One by one, the world is going to lockdown. And systems worldwide are just breaking down, okay? The movement of people, movement of goods, finance, things are just literally breaking down. Even the European Union, internal travel was breaking down.
There can't be scenario planning for something like
Exactly.
this. No one imagined it.
So, in that situation, you need some protocols to keep the world functioning, right? Now, WHO wasn't helpful, as you will remember. The UN wasn't being helpful. The only institution that sort of functioned at that time was the G20. And they decided that, look, we are the 20 most powerful and important countries in the world. Why don't, convincing everybody in the UN is going to take forever. Let G20 basically create a basic protocol of various kinds of economic, financial, and other protocols to keep the world functioning. So they gave this job to this group called the Framework Working Group. Okay. Now the Framework Working Group, of which I was the co-chair along with my colleague, my equivalent from the UK. So we were given the job, you now write down these basic protocols. So we wrote down that protocols, and they was updated a few times. And so that's how the world economy was kind of kept going using those, that global action plan. You can Google up what came out later. But that's not what I am going to talk about. I am going to tell you a side story which is not widely known. So here I am. So I've been given this rather important job. I'm working like crazy. I'm negotiating with 20 countries. There's a complete chaos going on in the world. And we are creating this document. It cannot be a very long document because, these are basic protocols. And most of this is about economic, finance type things. Maybe some human movement, trade, etc. So this is coming together. We are now maybe in the end of April. So it's taken us 3 weeks, negotiate, etc. I receive suddenly from one of the important countries, I'm not named, the representative in my group from the G20, I receive a one-pager with 3-4 paragraphs which relate to health issues. Now, remember, the Framework Working Group is clearly an economic finance track. It had nothing to do with health. There is a health group. And right in the beginning, we were quite clear that, we are not competent to do it. And this is, the health thing is happening. Jo bhi ho raha hai. Some other track should take. Yeah? But one sheet of paper turned up from them saying that, no, we should include this here. So I said, no, why on earth, why are we including this here? We are not the competent group on health responses. Let health, there's a health track in G20, let them do it. No, you see, it's too difficult. Anyway, this document will very quickly get accepted by finance ministers, governors, and ultimately by the heads of government. So it's a good place. Let's just put it in and, jaldi mein ho jayega. So, it sounded all very reasonable. Still, I said I'll read it. If nothing else, I'll edit the English. So when I read it, most of it is goody-goody stuff, which didn't mean anything, except for one paragraph, which sounded a bit odd. It basically stated that, today we don't have any vaccines, but in the future there will be vaccines. Because remember, this is April 2020. So nobody knows pre-vaccine.
And nobody knew at that time.
And what is going on. So someday there will be vaccines. When the vaccines happen, the world will have a problem that some countries, few countries will have the vaccine and many countries will not. So the world needs a protocol for distributing these vaccines reasonably. Now, audited me, but it still sounds reasonable, in the realm of something that sounds reasonable. Then it has another line, and that this job should be given to an organization called CEPI, CEPI, based in Oslo or some such place. I thought this was rather odd, because I had never heard of this institution. And in any case, if you want to give this to something, you should give it to some multilateral kind of way. Either working group of G20 does it, or even though WHO had performed horribly, still it is the correct platform to do it, or do it some such place. Why is a private body called CEPI want to do it? So I googled it up. And it's very interesting. It was basically a completely new private body, funded by some of the same USAID, Soros, these kinds of people. They, by the way, now removed all their sponsors from their website, so you can't see it, but you can still Google these things up. And this random body was supposed to do it. So I went back and said, sorry, how can we introduce it? We can't. So he said, no. And then, several ambassadors and high commissioners of major countries called me up to pressure me to try and have this in. Why are you being recalcitrant? I said, look, I don't know. But now, point is, if we had agreed to this, imagine what would have happened.
We couldn't make our own decision.
We would have not been able to make, we had signed up to this, then we would not be able to decide as a country where to distribute all this, our vaccines. There's some random organization called CEPI would decide. And so I began pushing back. So I then looked further into it. So he said, no, India is involved in this. So how is India involved in this? So I called, there was a joint secretary at that time called Love Agarwal, if I'm not mistaken. Very busy guy, I'm sure, at that point in time. Still, I called him and said, do you know anything about CEPI? I didn't know him at that time. But anyway, I called him up in the middle of all this chaos. Do you know anything about CEPI? So he also didn't know. Now I really began to get fishy. So he said, let me get back. So he got back and said, yes, there is an organization, people, but it's not a governmental organization. We are not represented on it. So I went back and told these people who were pushing for this. So they said, no, India was involved in getting it going, this, that. We have Indians on the board. So I looked it up. There was indeed an Indian on their board, but not an official. In fact, I don't even know. I won't not name the person. But this person came from a institution in South India, medical institution in South India, and which is not a government agency either. It's a Christian medical college. And who may or may not be Indian also. I don't know whether they have an Indian name.
But citizenship could be of
could be anything.
Could be of Indian origin.
In any case, not an official representation. So how on earth does this completely private agency decide how the world's vaccines will be redistributed? So we came within an inch. Thank God I read this. But by the way, by this point I was really suspicious. So I took this to the Honorable FM, Nirmala ji, and said, ma'am, this is the thing. So he said, you do what you think is correct. He also thought. So I got her full backing. So once I had her backing, and then I went and I just refused. And so we kept that thing. It's not there in the thing. But I have kept all the papers for this. I have saved it because I think it's part of history.
I think you need to write a book on this.
Absolutely.
This is clearly, the means through which information is controlled, and many of those who are powerful seek to control us and make us accept their power.
Absolutely. So now
that's why we need to push back.
Absolutely. So now coming back to NHS. So NFHS, again, I began to get suspicious about many things in it. And I and the late Bibek Debroy, who was who sadly no more, he then encouraged me to dig deep. And then we wrote a bunch of articles about this in the newspapers, about how donors are effectively getting and sort of guiding all this stuff. And so we began to write about it. I also wrote about how anemia data, for example, is deliberately collected in the wrong way.
So that some pharma company can make money off it.
I don't know why they do it, but it's a fact that they collect anemia data in a way that is well known to be the wrong way, which is by pinprick and capillary, rather than intravenously, which is the sensible way of doing it. Now, why would you do a nationwide survey for anemia, knowing fully well that is the wrong way of doing it? It is well known. It's not a new thing. It's well known that this is the way to do it.
I'm so happy that you've taken up this issue.
So now that we have taken it up, the good news is that this current NHFS that is being done purely by the Indian government, and I have to thank, of course, the political leadership, specifically Mansukh Mandaviya ji, who was then the health minister, who took this matter rather seriously and manages to change it. But you see, these are things that are embedded all over the government. So unless you really begin to dig into this, you don't even notice it, because that is almost the landscape in which you live. How many things will you peel out? Because this is, I mean, who would guess that NHS is run by a foreign agency? It sounds so sarkari, right? So anyway, the good news is that in the last few years, we have been, whether it's pushing back against the World Bank WGI or getting rid of USAID from our medical data collection, that doesn't mean, this sort of thing doesn't still exist. There are many other areas we can work in. But finally, we recognize these issues and are pushing back against them.
In a way, these are the systems of control that have been set up by those who've been powerful for a few centuries. And it's there in every country in the world.
And there are many things that we ourselves believe entirely these days to be our fault or part of our system, whereas in fact the source of it is something like this. And let me give you another example of this. So in case there's some people in the audience who think I'm paranoid and over exaggerating, let me give an example of where this sort of social engineering has happened. So you all know that in India, since the 1970s and 80s, there has been a problem with gender selective abortions. Yeah. This has led to a bias in the gender at birth, sex ratio at birth.
Particularly in some states, ironically the richer states.
No, so here I will tell you, it's not about rich and poor, it's about where the location is. It happened to be at one point the richest state. So let me tell you a little bit about it. So it turns out that in the 1950s and 60s, there was a series of academic papers being written in Western universities which were paranoid about overpopulation. And they were basically saying that there are countries like India, China, etc., that are breeding too fast. And we
Malthusian paradox.
And it was very much a clearly racist thing. Okay. Now, since the Nazis, the term eugenics had become less usable. So now that entire discussion had now got couched as population control. Okay. And so there were these academic things, and one of the conclusions they arrived at was that, look, it doesn't matter how many men there are. Population growth depends on the number of women a population has. Right? In theory, you can have one man and many women, and population can still grow. The other way around does not work. So therefore, can we weaponize son preference in countries like India and China in a way that you can then lead to the gender ratio to be skewed? So with this in mind, there were these American think tanks funded, by the way, by Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, etc. And all of that I'm saying is well documented. So you can read all of what I'm saying and very well documented. What they began to do is they sent a bunch of sort of aid workers and intellectuals, etc., into India. And interestingly, to China as well. And they convinced the governments of that time with this thing that, look, your population is blowing up. Why don't we help you by introducing abortion so that now families can choose the kind of family they want? Now, it's not like they were doing this without knowing what would happen. So the first bunch of ultrasound machines that were imported into India were imported into India with Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation funding. The first few thousand sex selection abortions that happened in India happened in AIIMS. Many of the doctors and the people, the women on which it was carried out are still alive. And then, once this was got popularized, remember, these people also have their hands into the entire medical system. So they began to get this popularizing various kinds of excessive measures. 1970s. This is also the time of Nazbandi and all of this kind of. All of this kind of thinking was being driven by these Western NGOs. who were infiltrating our system and doing social engineering. Now, then, of course, many of them, as you know, are based on Lodi Road. Now, if you look at the alignment of highways out of Delhi from that time, that is where the worst of all of this happened. That's why Western UP, Haryana, Punjab, Northern Rajasthan. That is where the gender ratios went awry, because that is where these aid agencies could get into their white-colored utility vehicles and drive out to the countryside and spread the word. And this is how we ended up with this skewed gender ratio, of which later on the same chaps came and blamed Indian culture and all kinds of other things. But it was they who deliberately did it. And as I said, don't have to take my word on it. This is very well documented.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So if you are concerned about foreign agencies taking control of our information systems, our health system, our education systems, please be very worried, because you will be manipulated. And now, of course, with all the revelations that we are getting on what USAID was doing with all the money emerging, it's become a hot topic. But it's nice that it's now become mainstream, because when I was fighting these for the last many years, many people may have thought I was some sort of a mad conspiracy theorist. And why are you getting so annoyed about democracy index and NFHS? And I was Vivek Da and I wrote these articles on very suspicious questions about mosquito nets and other things, which the NHFS has. It also has very interesting social orientation. So the questionnaire for men is only 29 pages long. The one for women is 96 pages long. Now, some of it is again legitimate, because it's about prenatal information on prenatal health for young children health. Oh, all right, that's fine. But there is a significant amount which is sociological. For example, it is full of questions about domestic violence against women in Indian families, intra-family violence, for example. And the questions are loaded and in a certain way that you will get certain kinds of answers. So, for example, one of the questions is, does your husband get annoyed if you talk to other men? Now, I'm quite sure this happens with many men, but if you had an exact same question for women, for men, you would probably get a very similar ratio of answers.
Does your wife get annoyed?
Yeah, does your wife get annoyed if you talk to other women? You probably get a very similar answer. So a lot of it is suggestive. And you can see that this is then a way of introducing certain social agendas into our policies, and then ultimately gets hardwired in laws and all kinds of other things.
I think this is key learning, especially India, which has suffered centuries of foreign rule.
Absolutely.
That if any foreigner coming into into our country
and manipulating narratives.
So
they will come in and say, your religion is bad, your something is... That's how the missionaries used to do, right?
One should question.
So they will first research your texts, they will then they will manipulate it and introduce all kinds of funny narratives into it, which will take you years to get out of. Aryan Dravidian divide, or all kinds of things they will do. Then they will manipulate you. The same, that same thing is being now done in certain areas of health, social, and many other things. This I told you in the finance and all that, they are doing it with these indices and rankings.
And that we're all aware of. The good thing is we can actually push back on it right now, because we know their language. We can read many of their papers, but they can't actually. Many of them can't read our Indian language papers. We can push back. We should ask questions. Not everything about the West is bad, but if there are interventions into our society, we must question. Sanjeev, thank you so much, man, for raising a very, very critical issue, and thank you for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode, like and share it, please. And if you want to receive the notification for the next episode, click subscribe, please. Thank you.